Hello, and welcome to an introduction on writing and speaking, or to sound more posh and technical, mode, an aspect of register. Hopefully, because you've watched the last presentation, you know exactly what I'm talking about. In that presentation, we looked into the way language is impacted by the social situation and learned about a way of describing this phenomena called register, and the way this itself can be divided up into three aspects. Tenor was the role and relationship part of a situation, field was the knowledge or type of practice, and mode was the role language is playing in the social situation. Well, we didn't get to look very much at this last one, and that's going to be the subject of this presentation. Amongst other things, studying mode is going to get us to think about the difference between writing and speaking. And of course, as educators, we have a particular interest in the writing of the academy, academic writing. What is it? Why is it the way it is? But before we get into all this, let's just recap on the other two aspects of register, tenor and field. Tenor is to do with the impact roles and relationships play on the language as a result of the three variables. Relative frequency of contact, equality of power, and level of involvement. A text also initiates some form of interaction, and linguistic forms like clausal mood congruence signal the kind of relationship the text is likely embodying. And there are the three continuums. So that's mostly what we dealt with in the last presentation. And also we looked at field. Basically what the language is being used for. Advice on baby care, looking after your PC, getting someone to help you with moving some furniture, representing a theory about evolutionary biology, and so on and so forth. Field is how the text relates to experience. Who or what is doing what to whom, when, where, why, how, this kind of thing. And this gives us the variable shallow to deep in terms of technicality. So when we think of language then, from a social linguistic perspective, we really need to understand it as a social event and not simply as a formal structure. Language is always part of an event, or better still, constitutes the event. You know, we sometimes do violence to this insight when we represent language in a decontextualized way to children, as though language could be something that is merely attached to practices rather than being integral to what a practice is. You know, if you think about it, this is really the insight of the whole language movement, which was which I see it as a philosophical position regarding language, really, more than a method. This notion of event, social event, is critical for understanding the third aspect of register. And let's get to that now. Mode. Mode is the function of the text in the event, and it includes both the channel taken by language, spoken or written, extempore or prepared, and its genre or rhetorical mode. It might, say, be a narrative, it might be didactic, it might be persuasive, or it might be an instance of phatic expression. That's just a fancy term meaning using language in a way that is more about being social than exchanging information, and so on. In this presentation, we're going to focus on this aspect of mode by asking the question, what is the difference between spoken and written language? Well, let's start by considering that the concept of communication presupposes the notion of distance or proximity. And this distance is both a spatial distance and an interpersonal one. And perhaps one obvious difference between writing and speaking is where they lie then on a continuum of spatial or interpersonal distance. So here's a challenge. Ask yourself how each of these deals with visual contact, aural contact, aural just means hearing, and rate of feedback between conversants. So here's what I came up with. One thing to notice is the degree of feedback that is likely relative to the degree of spatial or interpersonal distance. In other words, these forms differ in terms of their dialogicality, from face-to-face being the most dialogical to the novel being the most monological. Mode is to do with the role of language, remember. What this says is that some modes are going to be more or less dialogical. So we use language as part of getting things done. Pass the salt, please. Said at a dinner table is said to make something happen, to make a change in the world. Language is a means to a non-linguistic end most of the time. To be or not to be, pined Hamlet. The idea that we are, that we have being, is not something we can observe. Being isn't a quality like heavy or green. So here's an interesting thing. Language can be used for very abstract reflection, when getting something done in the world takes a back seat. Now, I've got something to show you, and I want to share this with you. It's in my hand. Hornworms sure vary a lot in how well they grow. Yes, indeed. Our everyday experiences can be reflected upon for no apparent use than that they can be reflected upon and shared with others. So language makes this possible, and if it wasn't so, well, we wouldn't have science. Hornworms' growth exhibits a significant amount of variation. That sounds very scientific. Can you hear a difference compared to the first statement? It's all in the register. Well, we'll explore this in a bit more detail later on. But for now, just notice how pass the salt is meaningful because it's so wedded to its social context. It constitutes the context in a way. Such language is part of what it means to eat dinner together. Pass the salt. I love this salad dressing. Whereas statements like hornworms' growth exhibits a significant amount of variation, well, is wanting to say something about hornworms universally or generally, not just about this little inchworm I'm holding in my hand. Science is going to use language to make objective and universally valid claims then. And the famous to be or not to be is an instance where language is being used to reflect on what it means to even exist. Very abstract. So here's another continuum. What we might call a continuum of abstraction. Mode is the role language has in constituting everyday human experience all the way to allowing us to abstract from or reflect on that experience. Right? So let me say that again. Mode is the role language has in constituting everyday human experience all the way to allowing us to abstract from or reflect on that experience. Well, before looking with more detail into the differences between writing and speaking modes, let's just summarize this aspect of register on a chart to complete this view of register, our view of register. So here is tenor. How text initiate interaction determined by how much contact we have with each other, how equal we are, how emotionally involved or detached we are with something. Those three things. Field is basically how text relate to experience, formally to informally, technically to non-technically, drawing upon the deep or shallow taxonomies that we talked about in the last presentation. And so mode completes the picture. Mode focuses on how language enables us to do things in certain ways. And though there's overlap, speaking enables certain things and writing enables other things. Well, what kind of enabling are we talking about, and what is it about the mode of language that produces these differences? That's what we're going to look at next. And to do this, I'm going to get some help from a famous US linguist, although he might want to be called a critical discourse analyst, named James G. The two statements that I showed earlier actually came from a paper that G wrote about the language of science, and his paper argues, amongst other things, that becoming comfortable with academic social language is at the heart of school-based literacy. Here are the two statements. G provides a very interesting and thorough analysis of these two statements. The first one he takes as an instance of life-world social language. What's that mean? Well, that's the sort of language we use when we're behaving as ordinary, non-specialist people. While the latter one is an instance of a science social language. Part of a specialist discourse, he might say. We shouldn't have to qualify the word language with social, but it helps to remind us about how important an important aspect of the phenomena we can easily take for granted, the sociality of language. Alright, though my analysis will be similar to G's, I want to specifically couch mine in terms of the categories of register that we've been using. So let's start by considering the tenor aspect of register. Tenor is to do with the role relationships play. Who's involved? Well, in the life world statement, amongst other things, it's clear that hornworms are involved. The subject of the sentence names what it's about, hornworms, and the word sure signals that these are things that we have some empathy with, cute little things. But in contrast, the science statement's subject or topic is not hornworms, but a feature of them. The hornworms have disappeared, so to speak. So I think it's clear where these might fall on the tenor involved versus distant continuum, human involvement versus human detachment. When we consider the life world statement's attention to dynamic processes and change, it uses verbs, notice, like vary and grow. We tend to care about things that change and transform. But in contrast, the specialist sentence turns the dynamic processes into abstract things, and it does this through nominalization. Vary has become variation, and grow has become growth. We're going to look at this notion of nominalization in a bit more detail later on, but because it seems to be a really big feature of academic language. Well, let's connect this to mode, the experience versus reflection continuum. Specialist discourses seem relatively committed to linguistic forms that replaced the involved agency of things and how we might encounter them to a more abstract way where categories like variation and growth can be logically related to each other. It's as though the first sentence signals empathy where the specialist wears the neutral white coat of science. The life world sentence makes a reference to quantity, how well they grow. That's also evaluative. It's like it's saying hornworms vary in how they grow, but there's also a sense of the optimal here, signalled by the phrase how well. And G calls this, coining a term, telically evaluative. Telos, T-E-L-O-S, telos, means like an ideal endpoint. So G is pointing out that this sentence is implying that hornworms have an ideal that they are meant to move towards. But the specialist sentence avoids the telically evaluative and has the phrase significant amount instead. What's the difference? See, both sentences refer to quantity of growth. Well, by calling it significant amount, the specialist sentence is referring to the field in which it is participating. The field where significant amount is understood in terms of the procedures and standards of the practice, in this case the practice of biology. So significance is defined not in the hornworm's terms, what is good and proper for hornworms, their telos, but what the field deems significant. Well, let's connect this to the field shallow taxonomy versus deep taxonomy continuum. The everyday life world sentence evaluates what is optimal for hornworms out of a sense of what seems important and interesting to the person who's speaking, but in contrast, the specialist sentence references a technical field that has established categories for making evaluations. Importantly different then. Established categories, instances of a field taxonomy. And unless we're also practitioners of that field, we can only guess what deep taxonomies are being cautiously drawn upon. Finally, there's one more thing I want to point out in the area of mode. We could imagine that the life world sentence was spoken by someone rather than being written down. In contrast, the specialist sentence would not be out of place in a science textbook. So we can say something then about the relative dialogicality of these two utterances. I feel myself easily engaging in a conversation with a person who says, hornworms sure vary a lot in how well they grow, but hornworms' growth exhibits a significant amount of variation. Could be conceived as a move in a conversation only with someone who is similarly and equally involved in the technical field. So let's just pause here and reflect on what all this might mean for us as teachers. James G. wrote, when one has to leave the life world to acquire and then use the specialist language, these are some of the things that are lost. Concrete things like hornworms and empathy for them, cute little things. Changes and transformations as dynamic, ongoing processes, and telos and appreciation. Think of all this in terms of the baby texts introduced in the last presentation. Formal academic register isn't just an overcoat that we put on. It comes with certain stances on human experience. It comes with implications for who we are or who we could be. Well, G in the same paper also indicates what might be gained by acquiring such a language. Abstract things might be gained, relations among them, traits, and quantification and categorization of traits. Evaluation. And evaluation that's not just rooted in our own feelings, but from within a specialized domain. And he poses this question. Why would anyone, most especially a child in school, accept this loss? What would make someone see acquiring a scientific social language as a gain? And he answers it this way. How do we make this happen? What's our responsibility as teachers here exactly? Are we, or how are we, committed to the ideology embodied in these registers? I mean, we're all familiar with the disparity between educational attainment between certain ethnic groups. We're all now familiar with the problem and challenge of what has become popularly known as closing the gap. Well, I feel that closing the gap is tricky because my kids just don't have a feel for the academic registers they'll need to get on. Let me say that again. I feel that closing the gap is tricky because my kids just don't have a feel for the academic registers they'll need to get on. No, let me say it again. The challenge of closing the gap is related to a limitation in register repertoire, especially registers appropriate to the work of academia. Now that sounds much more like the Professor of Education. Again, does this remind you of the baby texts? Alright, imagine you are behind in your college work and you have to explain to your professor that your essay has been handed in after the due date. So this is what you tell him. Look, I handed my essay in late because my kids got sick. But imagine you also wrote to him explaining the situation. And one of the lines reads, because it's in a written mode, the register of the message changes. And this is usually the case. So register isn't just about academic work, it plays out in the way we use the writing mode, or rather the way the writing mode uses us. So modes are never neutral. They always privilege one stance over another. Of course, you can write in a very informal way, write as though you were speaking, but there are social expectations that sometimes have to be honoured if we want to avoid coming off as disrespectful or unintelligent. Let's look at these last two sentences a bit more closely. Both have the same content, the same set of actions and events in the real world, but there are some important linguistic differences. This is one sentence made up of two clauses. The two clauses are linked with the logical connective conjunction because each of the two clauses describes the concrete actions, hand in, get sick, expressed by verbs performed by different human actors. I, my kids, with the actors occupying first position in each clause. But in this sentence, the message has been condensed to fit one clause. How? Well, by turning the actions of handing in and getting sick into nouns. What nouns? Submission and illness, abstract nouns. So what? Well, by turning what were verbs, into nouns, the sentence is able to express a logical relationship between the two events, also through a noun, the noun reason, which now becomes the point of departure for the message. So the human actors of the first sentence have been demoted in the second sentence. Both the I and the my kids are no longer pivotal actors in the clauses, but only possessors, my, position now as qualifiers to the nouns essay and children. Also note the lexical change of kids to the RP English form of children. So have a go at comparing the register of these two. Because the jobs are more complex, programs to train people will take longer. The increased complexity of tasks will lead to the extension of the duration of training programs. The process extend, represented in the first sentence as will take longer, has been nominalized in the second sentence with the noun extension. The adjective phrase more complex in the first sentence has become complexity in the second, and also the adverb longer in the first sentence is now duration with the second in the second. Okay, so socially we might say that texts which are more nominalized tend to be prestigious, at least in certain social environments. But going back to G's challenge for teachers, is there anything going for nominalization besides social prestige? The question might be put like this: is the highly nominalized and lexically dense text of academic writing academically necessary? Let's look at this linguistically and consider the nominal group compared to the verbal group. In other words, let's compare what's going on when we generate noun phrases as opposed to verb phrases. Here's the nominal group. We'll start with this word, spiders. The 3 spiders. The 3 red back spiders. The 3 shiny red back spiders. The smallest of the 3 shiny redback spiders. The smallest of the 3 shiny redback spiders in the corner. You get the idea. And now for the verbal group. We'll start with the verb to spin. Spins. Is spinning. Has been spinning. Will have been spinning. May have been going to have been spinning. Okay, this isn't so easy, right? What's going on? The nominal group is the part of the clause that contains nouns and the words that accompany nouns. Well, we can do many things with nouns in English: specify, describe, classify, and qualify. We can also expand the verbal group, right? We saw that, just saw that. But this doesn't increase the content. It results in non-content aspects such as tense, number, aspects, voice, and so on. So here's the bottom line then. By turning verbs and other parts of speech into nouns, we increase the possible content of our text. That is, its lexical density. So here's a summary then of the advantages of nominalization other than the social ones we've reviewed. This presentation is entitled An Introduction to Writing and Speaking. So let's finish with a summary of these 2 modes. So let's just take this to say some things about the general differences then between speaking and writing. Perhaps the basic contrast between everyday speaking and formal writing is that speech is typically interactive. In spoken situations, we're usually using language to achieve some ongoing social action. Pass the salt. Move it over there. That one, I think. So this makes for a turn-taking, chain-like organisation compared to a more hierarchical organisation. And again, I'm mostly thinking of academic writing here. So with speaking, there is a sense in which the language obviously comes out of a context. But with writing, the context has to be established. And often that means spelling things out, saying things that would seem obvious and even insulting if you were to bring them up in conversation. A lot more words are needed. The structure of talk is largely dynamic. It evolves. Well, if you don't pass me that, I won't be able to get in here, and then we'll be stuck, because what will they say? And on and on and on, right? Such text accompanies action. An authentic conversation doesn't really have an agenda, which is why a so-called conversation with a telemarketer isn't really a conversation, right? In contrast, the structure of talk is largely, well, I just said the structure of talk is largely dynamic, but formal writing usually has to stand on its own, and therefore it will be structured synoptically, beginning, middle, end. The structure is predetermined. Along with speaking's dynamism and its spontaneity comes the inevitable false starts and plenty of opportunities to use the schwa sound, like that. But this wouldn't do with formal writing, which is often rehearsed for the final draft. But there's no implication of finality with everyday speaking. Another perhaps obvious feature of speaking compared to formal writing is the choice of words. An everyday lexis is used rather than a prestige lexis. And perhaps it isn't entirely fair to say it like this. It's not just a matter of prestige. There are valid reasons why a particular field needs to develop its own technical vocabulary, right? This one may be a bit of a surprise, but from a linguistic perspective it turns out that plotting the grammar of everyday speech is much harder than the semi-idealized text of formal writing. And owing to the deep taxonomies that are being used in academic discourse, speaking has a comparatively sparse lexical density, whereas formal writing is lexically dense. Alright, so as the moon comes into sharper prominence and the sun is excluded from human view, alright, change the register, Jed. At the beginning of this presentation, I defined mode as the function of the text in the event, and we looked at some important differences between speaking and writing, especially in terms of how this plays out for academic language. The rhetorical mode of academic writing is very important to understand because it plays such a big role in school success. All of this has been looked at from the perspective of the social situation or register. The social context both impacts and is realized within certain linguistic characteristics like mood congruence, which we discussed in the last presentation, nominalization, lexical density, and so on. In other words, we can't talk sensibly about social context unless we also talk about language, and we can't talk about language unless we also consider its sociality. Hence the word sociolinguistics, which marries the two, the social and the linguistic. Well, in the next presentation, we'll look at the notion of genre. If register is to consider the context of situation and its relation to language, genre is to consider the context of culture and its relation to language. Now, the word culture does not here mean ethnic culture, but the more wider notion of human practice, a framework of norms, values, traditions, in which humans live and get things done. So from this perspective, we can say that something like science is a human practice. It's a culture in this wider sense. This culture or practice is realized linguistically in terms of genres. Every practice has its genres, and understanding those genres, which seem to have the highest status in school, will be the topic of the next presentation. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and as always, take care.